get my screen up.
Yeah.
Right, good evening all, hope you can hear me fine. And just let me begin by saying that if you complete tonight's pilgrimage, I can't do anything. I can't forgive all your sins or offer you an indulgence or the promise of paradise. But I do hope that you find tonight's journey a rewarding experience. Because while not perhaps in the league of pilgrimages to the likes of Glastonbury, Canterbury, Whithorn or St Andrews, a walk around Linlithgow's pilgrimage trail can still be a fascinating, spiritually uplifting experience, even here in virtual reality. So let's set off around our ancient borough, visiting the most important places of worship or religious significance, historic and present day. There is indeed much to see and a great deal to ponder over as we walk back through the centuries. The pilgrimage sets off from St Peter's, which is my mother church, situated in a difficult spot to build a place of worship, squeezed into a tiny gap site in the centuries-old High Street. The 1820 map on the right shows the location which was chosen, a long and narrow cleared site. To get light into this edifice, the solution was for the architect to build a domed roof, windowed cupola, and at the front, a semicircular Diocletian window. Diocletian, named after the windows installed in the baths in ancient Rome, built for Emperor Diocletian, who ruled in the 3rd century AD, sometimes called thermal windows, as they were designed to keep in heat. The foundation stone of what then turned out to be a Byzantine-influenced church was laid, as seen on the left, in May 1927. And a year later, it was consecrated by Bishop George Somerset Walpole. He had raised most of the money required to build this house of God, and he raised the cash during a lecture tour of America, where donations were sought from the congregations to whom he spoke. He also raised funds in the same way to complete St Mary's Cathedral in Edinburgh by the construction of 2 subsidiary spires. He's seen here on the left, traveling to America in 1926 with his daughter, his wife having died the year before. He named the tiny Linlithgow church, just 12 meters by 7, after his late wife, Mildred. And a stained glass triptych was installed featuring, on either side of the risen Christ, 2 female saints, Margaret of Scotland and Mildred, the 8th century head of an abbey in Kent. The church was called St Mildred's until 1978, when it reverted to its original name of the early 20th century Episcopal Mission to Linlithgow, an offshoot of St Catherine's in Bowness. And recently, to commemorate Christine's retirement, we commissioned Meg Wallace to paint the picture of that window that you can see on the right. Outside, the front door is decorated with carvings executed by local craftsmen. They portray the central figure of Christ, his hand in the posture of benediction, flanked by supporting angels. Around the arch are depictions of creatures from the Revelation of St John. And the first beast, he writes, was like a lion, and the second like a calf, and the third beast had a face as a man, and the fourth was like a flying eagle, and all 4 beasts had each of them wings. Let us now wing our way eastwards along the High Street to Linlithgow Cross, a suitable name, you might think, for a Christian pilgrimage, but this cross refers not to the tree of crucifixion, but to the market or Merket cross, which once stood here beside the cross well, atop of which is a unicorn modelled on the one which used to grace the town's market marker. There are 10 references to unicorns in the Old Testament. In Numbers 24, the King James Bible says, God brought Jacob forth out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. The early Christians adopted the creature as a symbol of power and virtue. This is Domenichino's The Virgin and the Unicorn, painted in 1605. It depicts the legend that a unicorn will only become docile if it lays its head in the lap of a pure virgin. The Stuart monarchs of Scotland adopted the unicorn as their symbol, and it still features on the Scottish coat of arms. The one on the left was that of King James VI and I, and the right-hand one is the present royal arms. Linlithgow Cross is still the centre of borough life, home to many gatherings and happenings, including marches events, classic car rallies, torchlight processions, mass carol singing, and the switching on of the Christmas lights as part of the town's Advent fair. Climbing the mound of St. Michael up the Kirkgate, so called from the Old Norse for a roadway to a church, we arrive at St. Michael's, the town's oldest extant religious building, dating back to at least the 13th century when Bishop David de Burnham consecrated the edifice. The first thing to strike you is the arresting creation on the church tower. This is the famous crown of thorns, its spiky concept, an evocation of the object placed on Christ's head on his way to the crucifixion, both to cause him pain and to mock his claim of authority. Matthew's gospel says, and when they plaited a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." In addition to its overall symbolism, the crown is also made up of 12 upward pointing projections, all surrounding the central 58-foot centerpiece, together signifying Christ and his 12 disciples. The structure was designed by Geoffrey Clark, who had previously worked with Basil Spence, and he used the concept of a crown of thorns within Coventry Cathedral, in the sculpture, for example, shown on the left. The driving force behind the project was St. Michael's minister, David Steele, who invited Clark to his Linlithgow manse to discuss the scheme to complete the tower, which had for many centuries been graced with an elaborate stone crown, a monumental edifice which unfortunately had been removed in 1821, after showing dangerous signs of imminent collapse. For 143 years, St. Michael's had been shorn of its crowning glory, the tower looking unfinished compared to the still existing pinnacles on the cathedrals in Edinburgh, Perth and Aberdeen. Recreating the crown in stone was never an option, given the poor state of the tower, where a fracture running down to the west door could be seen. The telltale strengthening fixings inserted on the inside are still visible. Furthermore, there was no more acceptable matching masonry available with which to construct a replacement stone tower. The original stone had come from King's Cavil Quarry, which was flooded, and what was available from the ruins of Lochcote House had been used to repair the weathered fabric of the building. For a fee of 200 guineas, Clark set to work on his commission to produce, in a contemporary style, something that would reflect the fact that St. Michael's was not just an historic edifice steeped in its past, but part of a relevant modern spiritual community. Mind you, the Reverend Steele used as an example of relevant modern Linlithgow the developments taking place at the Cross in the early 1960s. I say no more, but let you linger nostalgically. Clark's ultimate design was accepted by the Kirk Session by 15 votes to 1. And as the townfolk saw the structure slowly taking shape over the summer of 1964, feelings were mixed. It was opposed by the General Trustees of the Church of Scotland, and in a poem written at the time by D.W. Thompson, he summed up some of the local opposition. Yon grand old kirk did me impress, it made me stop and stare, but I'm sure it would look twice as good without that thing up there. Ye silly gowk, I said to him, sometimes you get me doon. It's no scaffolding that's on the tap, it's supposed to be a croon. A croon, says he, well, michty me, that would be hard to guess. Whatever it's supposed to be, it looks an awful mess. Says I, I'll tell you honestly. In fact, I'll tell you flat. I think it is a sin to spoil a bonny kirk like that. Other comments included, it's like a big wigwam, and when does that rocket take off? However, David Steele stuck to his guns, making sure that the work was carried out by local tradesmen. The firm of Muirheads of Grangemouth was contracted to supply the laminated timber, while a Larbert firm supplied the required cladding. This allowed for a relatively lightweight structure, with only a minimal core of galvanized steel onto which the laminated timber was inserted. It was then sprayed with several coats of epoxy resin and finally clad with super purity malleable aluminium, which had been anodized to a golden honey color. Actually, Clark was apparently never very pleased with the final color, which had come out to a different hue than he intended. At the dedication of the spire, he was heard to remark that he considered it too brassy. Despite the criticism and reservations, the opinion of professional architects and artists was favourable. The foremost artistic commentator of the day, Sir Nicholas Pevsner, declared it a masterpiece, which had impressed him on the spot, and which, in his opinion, provided a very successful solution to the problem of joining something frankly modern to something from the past. In time, the crown gradually became, to most, a much loved local icon. Its unforgettable silhouette visible for many miles around, its shape and colour changing with the viewer's position and the weather and the seasons. Its original golden hue faded to a silvery sheen. At night, it can be transformed into a variety of colours. Here, it has been lit in the colours of the Ukrainian flag in support of that poor war-torn nation. It is also used as a logo on the badges of several local organisations. However, almost 60 years after its installation, the crown is showing its age. A close-up inspection revealed that the aluminium cladding had deteriorated, allowing water to penetrate, resulting in much of the woodwork urgently needing replaced. This can only be done by stripping the cladding, repairing the rotten sections, and then recladding the whole crown, perhaps in the colour as envisaged by the architect. Using modern colour-fast materials would mean that it would always retain that chosen hue. Very few colour pictures exist of the newly constructed creation, as the vast majority of 1960s photographs were in black and white. These views, dating from 1965, are the nearest I've got for showing the original colour. So the question now is, should the restored crown revert to the original gold, or should it be kept in the faded silvery tones with which we have become familiar? Whatever the colour chosen, purple, pink, green, permission needs to be obtained from the local conservation officer. Thereafter, funding will hopefully come from a heritage repair grant and from local money-raising efforts, such as this one you've kindly sponsored. The sometimes controversial but always striking pinnacle may be its crowning glory, but so much has happened within the fabric below. In this brief pilgrimage around the town, suffice it to say, it has been worshipped in by kings and queens, including Mary Queen of Scots, who would have been baptised here in 1542, and who revisited the church on her return to Scotland in 1561. It has been used and abused by many historical figures, including John Knox and the Lords of the Congregation, who cleansed it of its Roman Catholic statues and symbols, leaving behind just some carved stone altar panels, now in the vestry, 26 empty, once saint-filled niches, and the mutilated statue of St. Michael. In the mid-17th century, Oliver Cromwell and the Roundhead soldiers took over the building, practicing musket firing at its walls, and sleeping in the upper gallery while down below in the nave they sacrilegiously stabled their steeds. Next came bonny Prince Charlie in 1745, parading triumphantly through the Kirkgate Arch and past the church, on his ultimately ill-fated attempt to restore the British throne to the Stuart monarchs. Robert Burns, on his visit in 1787, called the church, quote, a poor, pimping place of Presbyterian worship. He cared little for its somewhat dilapidated state, and the items he saw there, which were used to punish those who broke the strict Presbyterian laws, the jugs, which change you by the neck, and the cutty stool. For Burns, they were both too close to home. Over many centuries, church leaders and worshippers have affected and altered the life and fabric of the building, demolishing, rebuilding, reconfiguring, desecrating, beautifying, illuminating, and praising God within. Who do you recognize here? Are you playing my Spot the Minister competition? It is a house blessed by the name of Michael, the patron saint of our borough, the name often given to a Christian church built on a previously pagan site, and usually on a hilltop, where the archangel traditionally appeared as the commander of the armies of heaven, leading the forces of good against evil and wickedness. We shall meet him again on our journey, but now here is an appropriate offering for us pilgrims, taken from St. Michael's own prayer calendar. Loving God, thank you for bringing us to this living church in this beautiful sanctuary. As we travel, help us to be open to the wonder and variety of your creation. Help us to show your love, to share your generosity, to build your peace. When our journey is over, remind us to give thanks for new experiences and for a safe return. And with these words still ringing in our ears, let us return to the high street and continue eastward till we stand outside the building shown on the left. Previously, as shown on the right, behind the Lumsden's lemonade cart, the St. Michael's Hotel. This hostelry was built on the site of a wonderful 16th century building called the Mint, the one-time headquarters of the Knights of St. John, a crusading order which originally assisted pilgrims in the Holy Land. Their beautiful Linlithgow Tower House, with its wonderful banqueting hall, was demolished in 1885. However, the oak beams you can see in the centre were saved, and they now grace a 19th century extension to a 16th century tower house in Barnton. The White House, it's called, and it's now the home of a fairly well-known character, the author of the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling. In front of where the Mint once stood is St. Michael's Well, dated 1720. It also carries the quaintly spelled legend, St. Michael is kind to strangers, a motto we would hope is still adhered to by the people of Linlithgow today. The first act of kindness towards 18th century travellers coming into the town was, of course, the offer of clean, fresh water, flowing down from the Bathgate Hills and out of a spout on the side of the well, now long gone. St. Michael protected the town's water supply and much more. And we share Michael as a patron saint with several cities, such as Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, where his shielding powers were never more needed. He is also the patron saint of many groups, including police officers. Here is part of the policeman's prayer. St. Michael, heaven's glorious commissioner of police, who once successfully cleared God's premises of all its undesirables, looked with kindly and professional eyes on your earthly force. Give us, Lord, cool heads, stout hearts, and an uncanny flair for investigation and wise judgment. As darkness descends, make us the terror of burglars, the friend of law-abiding citizens, kind to strangers, polite to boors, strict with lawbreakers, and impervious to temptation. And when we lay down our earthly truncheons, enroll us in your heavenly force, Michael, where we will be proud to guard the throne of God. That last slide and this one shows Linlithgow's newest representation of St. Michael, the statue created by Alan Herriot and situated at the Low Port. It depicts the saint in typical pose, slaying the forces of darkness in the form of a dragon. Speaking to Alan at the unveiling ceremony, he admitted that he had received some criticism over its depiction of an innocent creature being cruelly slain. But of course, the dragon is and has been for centuries a representation of malevolence and iniquity, horrors which the good saint is slaying. The left-hand illustration here shows the statue being created in Herriot's studio near Pennacook. The central photo was taken at its installation, and on the right, Councillor Tom Cohen has just unveiled it, remarking at the time that the sculptor had used his face as the model of one of the characters on the sculpture, either the saint himself or the dragon. He left the audience to decide, and I leave you also to choose. The statue is well worth a closer look as it's full of details. Try, for example, to find the symbols on Michael's belt depicting the 12 tribes of Israel, who were protected by the archangel, as this traditional prayer demonstrates. Illustrious leader of the heavenly army, defend all peoples in the battle against the rulers of the world of darkness and the spirit of wickedness. The statue is at the Low Port. But let us hark back briefly to the High Street again. Just opposite the St. Michael's Well, there stands one of the oldest buildings in the borough, the 17th century Hamilton's Land, photographed here in 1929. An earlier property on the site was the one-time residence of Patrick Hamilton, who would walk from his dwelling to attend the Linlithgow Grammar School, which stood where the Rose Garden is today. Over the years, the school was enlarged and altered before burning down in 1902, as shown on the top right. Below that is an architect's drawing, clearly showing the position of open fireplaces and hot air vents, pretty likely to have been the cause of the blaze. Initially a devout Roman Catholic intended for the priesthood, Patrick Hamilton became disenchanted with the corruption and false doctrines he saw within his church, and he began to preach loudly against them. His outpourings came to the attention of James Beaton, Archbishop of St. Andrews, and with the blessing of the Linlithgow-born king, James V, Patrick was arrested and taken to St. Andrews. His trial was a sham. He was summarily sentenced to death, and in order to prevent any rescue attempt, he was taken for execution on that very same day, to be burned at the stake outside St. Salvator's College. His bravery impressed all who watched. In a rain shower, he was fastened to a stake, firewood placed around him, a quantity of gunpowder strapped under each arm and set on fire, scorching his left hand and one side of his face. He called out with a strong voice, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. How long shall darkness overwhelm this realm?" It took him 6 hours to die, the rain-soaked, slow-burning fire causing him great agony, through which he tried to speak until the smoke choked him. His bravery impressed all who saw the event. John Lindsay, Archbishop Beaton's advisor, remarked that, quote, "The smoke of Maester Patrick Hamilton hath infected all those on whom it blew." It is alleged that the heat from the fire burned his image into the wall of nearby St. Salvator's Chapel, seen here in the top left. In the late 1920s, a memorial was dedicated to Linlithgow's son, Scotland's first Protestant martyr, on the exact spot where he died. Students at the university believe it's bad luck to stand on the letters PH for fear of being cursed and failing their final exams. If they do inadvertently touch the letters, in order to lift the spell, students have to participate in an annual event held at 5 a.m. on May the 1st, which involves running into the North Sea in order to wash away the curse. Pilgrims still gather at the place where the 24-year-old former Linlithgow pupil died, and they recite a prayer written by Hamilton himself. What is it to say that Christ died for thee? It is that he changed thy perpetual death into his own death. For thou he madest the sacrifice, and he suffered the pain, and that for the love he had for thee. Back at Linlithgow's Lowport, the old entry through the town wall, past the new statue, is St. Michael's Roman Catholic Church, designed by Peter Paul Pugin, the foremost 19th century architect in the Gothic Revival style. The building was partially open for Mass in 1888 and officially dedicated in 1893, becoming the spiritual home of Linlithgow's Catholic population, initially of the many Irish folk who came to work in the shale industry. Previously, the Catholic congregation had worshipped in Spence's Tannery and then in the Baird Hall, now a private residence at 224 High Street. Neither premises were satisfactory, and the need for a dedicated place of worship was answered by Father John Murphy, who, as a trained stonemason, set about building the church himself. In 1940, Father Michael McGovern became parish priest, and it was he who was instrumental in creating tennis courts in the grounds and the building of the Queen Margaret Hall. In 1942, he set up the Laetare International Youth Centre, which initially was used to house Polish soldiers throughout their stay during the war. In gratitude, they left behind the shrine to the Virgin Mary. Retracing our steps, we shall now head eastwards through the site of the old High Port, another gateway through the town wall, marked by brass studs on the roadway. On our left, where Tesco now stands, was an area called the Middle Raw, whereon was a chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary, destroyed at the Reformation. Later, the area became the site of Nobel's explosive factory. We are aiming, though, for the conical pagoda roofs of the former St. Magdalen's distillery, now converted into flats. The distillery for many years was in the hands of the Dawson family, thus the street opposite being named Dawson Court. They look a cheery bunch, the Dawsons shown here, don't they? The distillery closed in 1983, and this bottle in the centre of cask strength single malt will cost you £1,500. The whisky manufactory took its name from a small hamlet outside the town wall, once the site of a Lazarite establishment, a leper house, caring for sufferers from that terrible disease and other ailments. There are 16th century references to the hospice in charters signed by King James IV, and it is also mentioned in borough documents passing legislation to control leprosy. A 1448 manuscript records a legacy left to, quote, the Lazaretto of St. Mary Magdalene. Local legislation permitted lepers to beg around the town, as long as they used a set of clappers to signify their presence, not a bell, as was used elsewhere. The clappers shown on the right are in the Wellcome Museum in London. Leprosy often has extreme effects on the larynx, meaning that loss of voice is one of the classic symptoms, and so the clappers warned the townsfolk. We might remember, as we pause here, the biblical story of a leper, as told by Matthew. A man with leprosy came and knelt before Jesus and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. And immediately the man was cleansed of his disease. Situated at the hamlet of St. Magdalene's was an 18th century turnpike, where toll duties were collected from anyone using the roadway. Its name, the Maidlands Toll, was a corruption of the original Magdalenes, and the Holy Fair, which was held annually at this spot, also took the name Maidlands. A local saying regarding this event lasted in the town for many centuries with the phrase, "We'll settle this gin the Magdalen Fair," meaning any argument should be settled before the Holy Fair took place. The Lazarite Hospice of St Mary Magdalene, in this 1856 Ordnance Survey map, shown as a ruin, it's marked as a hospitium or hostelry. It was, of course, named after the woman who travelled with Jesus, helped to support his ministry, and was the first to witness his resurrection. Her name, Mary Magdalene, may mean that she came from the fishing village of Magdala on the Sea of Galilee. Her symbol is a string of pearls, which represent the tears she shed at the crucifixion. We'll walk now through the St Magdalene's housing complex and then westwards along the Union Canal towpath, praying that we are walking the true path mentioned in the book of Proverbs. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight and true. Watch the path of your feet, and all your ways will be established. Sadly, this advice was not followed by the horse, which was hired to pull a barge at the opening ceremony of the Canal Society in 1975. The poor creature strayed from the path called straight and plunged into the depths of despond. Huge consternation followed until the poor beast was guided to the slipway where it climbed out. Coming off the towpath at the canal basin, we now ascend the steep brae, formerly called Friars Lane, but since the early 19th century known as Manse Road. It got its name from the residence built at the top of the street for the Reverend James Dobie, who lived there for 23 years until his death in 1827. This on the right is his headstone in St Michael's Kirkyard. The old St Michael's manse in the Kirkgate had been in a deplorable condition, and the minister was anxious to have a new one built. However, a dispute arose over who was responsible for paying for the new building. Looking through some old documents, the Reverend Dobie found evidence that payment should come from the heritors, the wealthy, privileged persons liable to be taxed for church purposes. These gentlemen were not pleased at this, and so they had the new manse built as far from the church as they could, at the top of a very steep hill, just inside the borough boundary as the law laid down. The old manse is now a private residence, as a new manse was built in the Kirkgate in 1974 and extended in 1988. At the dedication of Dobie's new abode in 1804, the book of Proverbs was quoted. By wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. By knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. We are not going to climb as far as the old manse, for Dobie did indeed have a long, steep climb to make from St Michael's Church. We shall turn off halfway up the steep hill and enter the grounds of Nether Parkley, where a sign indicates the site of a Carmelite friary. Today, only the foundations are visible of the religious establishment of the Order of the Brothers of the Blessed Virgin Mary of Mount Carmel in northern Israel. It was the third such establishment to be set up in Scotland and dates from the very early 1400s, when it was dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Several archaeological excavations over the years have uncovered the remains of a church, a cloistered courtyard, a chapter house, a refectory, and sleeping accommodation, all recorded on a new information plaque, which was unveiled by MSP Fiona Hislop in August last year. Dressed in their brown habits with white cloaks, the Carmelite monks were popular in Linlithgow on account of the good works they did in the borough. Their local nickname was the Brethren Aboon the Toon. The order was disbanded at the Reformation and their friary gradually disappeared, its stone plundered for other uses. This is a prayer for the Carmelite way of life. Lord, you assembled the holy hermits of Mount Carmel as a family of pilgrim people, seeking to live in allegiance to Jesus Christ. Like them, inspire us to imitate the first Christians of Jerusalem, that we may build your kingdom. We'll continue past the Friary, through the trees, and into the 3-hectare Rosemount Park, once part of the impressive Rockville estate. Today, an area of greenery in an increasingly crowded area of town. It is also the site of the Friar's Well, which not only supplied fresh water for the nearby friary, but also by means of wooden pipes took water to the Crosswell. Some of the trees around the park date to the early 19th century, especially a 220-year-old sycamore. And to the east, another magnificent specimen that was also once in the lost Arboretum of Rockville. It is a cedar of Lebanon, Cedrus libani, a symbol of power and longevity as it can live for over 1,000 years. King Solomon used many of these cedars growing on Mount Lebanon to build his temple in Jerusalem. Let us give thanks for trees in the word of the psalmist. The righteous flourish like the cedar in Lebanon, like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. We'll now head to the northwest corner of the park, along Victoria Place, and onto what was formerly called Cadgersbury, seen here on John Sleezer's late 17th century print. It's now called Friarsbury, one of many ecclesiastically named streets around here, including Glebe, Priory, Carmel Laws, even Preston, which is a corruption of Priest's Tune. House building work in this area, this photo shows Friarsbury, uncovered several early Christian burials, suggesting that the hillside above the borough was always a site for religious worship. Some were buried in stone cists dating from the 5th century. All the burials were lying full length, on their backs, and aligned east to west, facing the rising sun in the hope of an early resurrection. At the bottom of a hill, the once whitewashed red pantiled building on the right has on its gable end a now rather eroded carving, proclaiming it as the Ebenezer Chapel. Ebenezer Erskine was a leading figure in the secession movement in the 1730s, when a group of dissenters broke away from the Church of Scotland over the issue of patronage, the disputed right of a powerful landowner to appoint a minister. Initially, the breakaway congregation met in the open air in the Bathgate Hills, but later they came into town and worshipped in small buildings, including the one we are at. Later, they became part of the group who set up Craigmillan Church. This is part of the Fratelli Tutti, an ecumenical prayer for all church groups. Come, Holy Spirit, show us your fraternal beauty reflected in all the peoples of the earth, so that we may discover anew that all are important and all are necessary, different faces of the one humanity that God so loves. We'll now turn right along Strawberry Bank, through the tunnel under the railway line, and just past Dogwell Wynd is this tiny whitewashed chapel, bearing the sign on the top right. It is a building belonging to the Brethren, a small group of worshippers who believe that the Bible is the supreme authority for church doctrine and practice. They also believe that all Christians are ordained by God to serve, and therefore all are ministers, able to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. My own grandfather, seen on the left, born into an Aberdeenshire crofting family near Fyvie, was himself a member of the Plymouth Brethren, and brought up to believe that all human beings are created in the image of God, and that the biblical command not to take a life was sacred. Consequently, at the outbreak of World War I, he refused to bear arms, and instead joined the Army Service Corps, driving lorries and ambulances, and witnessed some horrors, although he never talked of it. Continuing along Union Road, we come to St. John's Church, built in 1840 for the price of £750. It is a Christian evangelical establishment, describing itself as a fellowship of believers made in God's image and called as disciples of Christ to share the good news. The members of St. Peter's will always be grateful to St. John's for providing a spiritual home for their Sunday services during the period when they had to decant from their own church while the extension was being built. And St. John himself states, "If anyone sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him?" The large early 19th century house next door to the church was once used by the members of another secessionist church, the West Burghers, a group who supported the lawfulness of the oath taken by burgesses, which swore them to uphold the true religion professed within the borough. Dating from 1810, the owners were informed that the building shows evidence of being built from stones removed from the Carmelite monastery. For a while it was the manse of St. John's Church, but it's now a private residence called Lindisfarne, after the Holy Isle, whose abbey was an important early Christian centre of Celtic Christianity, attacked by the Vikings in the year 793. Later a priory was built, now the destination of pilgrims every Easter, when an ecumenical cross-carrying pilgrimage takes place. The pilgrims remember the early church leaders, such as Aidan and Cuthbert, and as they cross at low tide, they remember them across an ancient route marked by poles. The stained glass window shown here comes from the Holy Cross Monastery in New York. Beneath it is a prayer written by Saint Aidan. "As the tide draws the waters close in upon the shore, make me an island, set apart, alone with just you, God. Then with the turning of the tide, prepare me to carry your presence to the busy world beyond." We'll now walk down St. John's Avenue back to the High Street, where we'll turn left and head towards the spire of another religious building, visible ahead of us in the Falkirk Road. It is St. Ninian's Craigmalin Church, pictured here in the early 20th century. The 8th century Ninian shrine is at Whithorn in Galloway, where he may be buried, but here in Linlithgow, an early chapel was once dedicated to him. It stood on a triangular piece of ground at the entrance to what is now St. Ninian's Road. The ancient name was kept by the new church, although Ninian is in fact a mysterious figure about whom very little is known. Tradition has it that he was the son of a Christian king who studied in Rome and converted the southern Scottish Picts to Christianity. Almost all of the churches named after him are in the Scottish lowlands. St. Ninian's Craigmalin began as two dissenting congregations that came together under the Church of Scotland and worshipped here from the year 1875. Ray Simpson, in his Celtic prayer book, has a prayer to Ninian. "God of light, who led Ninian to witness to you in a land ignorant of your ways, to establish a community that shone in the dark, and to pray with courage that we may bring healing and light into the dark places of our time," the dark places around us. I do hope that this brief pilgrimage has brought some light into your lives. Do try to walk that route for real. I've outlined it, and you could go on an actual Linlithgow pilgrimage on foot. And thank you all for helping to restore the borough's golden crown. May it shine out for many generations to come. Thank you.
Well done, Bruce.